Um, Welcome everybody to our Critical Humanities series. And I have great pleasure in welcoming somebody who's probably speaking for the first time to an Indian audience, Professor Abdulkader Tayob from South Africa. We're very grateful, Professor Tayob, for agreeing to speak to us today. And so let me just quickly introduce our speaker. Professor Abdulkader Tayob holds the prestigious research chair in Islam, African publics, and religious values at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. He's a decolonial theorist of religion and works both on longer traditions of Islamic philosophy and on contemporary Islam in global and African public life. Professor Tayob's intellectual horizon rests on a very unusual career. He did his BA in Arabic, Islamic Studies and Mathematics, followed by BA honors in mathematics. Eventually, he went on to specialize in Arabic and in religious studies and did his PhD from Philadelphia, US on Islamic historiography, the case of Al-Tabari's Tarikh al-Rusul wa Muluk on the companions of Prophet Muhammad. Now, in Professor Tayob's own words, to study modern articulations of religion, one has to relentlessly modify and question existing theoretical and conceptual frameworks given to the discipline of religious studies. Which is why Professor Tayob, in some senses, travels across disciplinary borders as well as regional and linguistic borders, and uses an interesting methodology of putting philosophers of different traditions into conversation with each other. So, for example, William James with Al-Ghazali on the self, Nietzsche and Wittgenstein in conversation with Al-Mawardi and other medieval Aristotelians on ethics, and modern Muslim educationists and ethicists to older poets like Jalaluddin Rumi, in a way that implodes the ex-colonial and Orientalist framing of comparative religions. Now, Professor Tayob has innumerable publications. I'll just share a few to give you a sense of his intellectual range. One of the most recent of his essays, 2020, is called Religious Studies, Ethics, and Modernity, published in the Journal of Islamic Study. Another essay, 2018, is on decolonizing the study of religions, Muslim intellectuals, and the Enlightenment project of religious studies. He has many books, 2009 book on religion in modern Islamic discourse, 1999 book, which I found particularly interesting because I went on to read it after meeting Professor Tayob for the first time a couple of months back, which is called Islam in South Africa, Mosques, Imams, and Sermon. And it's a fascinating ethnographic, come philosophical, come religious, come contemporary political commentary on the public life of Islam. Professor Tayob is much awarded and much traveled. Once again, I really cannot read out the list. Most recently, he has received the 2020 George Foster Award of Humboldt Foundation, Germany. And I also wanted to share, and maybe Professor Tayob will speak about this a little later in his presentation. He's almost on the verge of finishing a very large project, which is called the South African Research Chairs Initiative on Islam, African Publics, and Religious Values. So there is much that can be discussed as findings of that project. Perhaps Professor Tayob will come back to it once he finishes his presentation. Professor Tayob, once again, a very, very warm welcome. And if you're ready, we are all eager to hear you. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this very generous introduction. I mean, I shouldn't say anything, but I have to make a small correction, which I'm quite happy to make. And that is that I have, in the last maybe, I think 10 years or so, I have been visiting India. At least the first time I visited India was in 2010. And since then,
oh dear, now that was one
yes.
credit I was going to take, but.
So I have also I attended a lecture at the csdsdelhi. And I really enjoyed visiting it in 2010. I think it was a lecture, Ashish Nandi and Canadian scholar Charles Taylor. Sorry. So I was really fascinated, and I've been keeping in touch with some of Indian scholars in the last maybe couple of years. I regretted not doing that earlier, and I've also started some contact with people in Pakistan. So I'm hoping that this is not my first time, but I'm really privileged and honored to be, speaking to particularly this in your colloquium, in your forum. So I don't know. I think I should assume some knowledge of the paper that we distributed beforehand, and I will try to summarize, or maybe just point. I was thinking that I should highlight some of the key points that I tried to make in this, sort of in a more general way, and then I will also focus on some very specific. So I will leave out a lot of the detail, if you don't mind. I don't know if that will work, for this particular meeting, because I assume that there's going to be much more discussion and maybe challenging some of the things that I have to say. So I've prepared a few comments on the paper itself, maybe my idea of my motivations for writing this and what I tried to do here. And at the same time, what I will do is, since you've opened up the topic in a broader sense, I've also thought a little bit about where I'm standing in relation to where I'm standing now in relation to where I come from. Perhaps this would also give a sort of another way of thinking about postcolonial or decolonial studies in the study of religion, specifically, but more general decolonial studies as such. So this paper that I've shared with you is not published yet, but it's more or less accepted, and I look forward to the comments. I can still correct the paper. I can still make some corrections based on the comments that I received from you. So I hope I've said that. Thank you very much for this invitation, and let me get started. So one of the things that we've been doing as part of the project that you mentioned, this the public life of Islam in Africa, has been to try and think for the last 10 years or so, looking at various sites of what does it mean to speak about religion in public life. Now, this is something that has emerged over the last couple of decades, as all of you know, that we have been thinking about, after the secularization theory, what do you replace it with? How do you speak about religion, in public life, and what are the kind of theoretical frameworks that you use? So I started with a very general idea of religion in the public life, inspired by Habermas and Casanova and others. But I was also aware that we need to think more carefully about how to think about religion in public life, not necessarily impose the models that we've got, but rather think from the ground up, both ethnographically, both in terms of what is going on, but also in terms of how we think about specifically religious responses or religious practices, debates, and constructions. And so one of the books that we read that inspired this paper is that of Mudimbe, who has produced a very, it's his book, I think, of 1997, Tales of Faith, in which he wrote about religion in Central Africa. And one of the major themes that runs through this book is to argue that no matter over the last 100 years of development of religious thought or theological thinking in Central West Africa, in spite of the fact that people try to come out of, or at least try to develop their own unique approach to theology and religion, or the study of religion in Central Africa, including himself, the dominance of what he called the colonial library cannot be ignored. So the colonial library looms large. It is the basis on which a lot of the reflections take place, and somehow the other, what is happening in Central Africa somehow can be traced back again to, or at least people end up relying, or it can be traced back to what is going on in Europe. And so I think that from that particular point, I thought the idea of an archive, and there are several people at the University of Cape Town, there's one particular project here specifically on the archive. The archive might be an important way to start thinking about, you know, how do we do the study of religion? Can we find an alternative archive? So this particular paper is part of, I think, a way of beginning to build you set up some kind of a building blocks of bringing back, you know, particularly post-colonial scholars, and seeing what they have to offer for us now. Because I think that we're not starting all from scratch as such, but I think that there's a lot of work that has been done that requires, you know, that requires us a certain level of appreciation, but also to see how they contribute. So Mudimbe's call for an archive, or his recognition that the archive is so colonial, his recognition of a colonial archive that dominates our work, including my own work, I think is one of those, you know, inspirations for doing this particular work, this particular paper. So in this paper, I make a distinction. Specifically, I set up a distinction between what I call a post-colonial critique of the study of religion, and a critical, what might be called a deconstructivist or a postmodernist critique of the study of religion. So in the last 2 or 3 decades, you know, since I was a graduate student, we've been exposed to a critical view of the study of religion. But I think that this distinction is not always made. So I want to claim that there is something very distinctive and something very special about a post-colonial critique as opposed to a postmodernist or deconstructive critique. And I've identified, you know, Talal Asad and David Chidester and Charles Long as people who clearly stand on the side of post-colonial. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at scholars, there's a kind of a gray area. But what I've tried to mention, and I've been seeing it, and I would be mentioning it in some other publications, you know, over and over again, that I find fascinating that a lot of some of the critical scholarship, which I call postmodernists or deconstructivists, that thrive on this idea that there are no generalized categories like religion, ritual, myths as such. When they emphasize this, you know, destruction of the modernist project, they don't actually emphasize too much, they don't emphasize much on both the of colonial modernity, neither do they say much about the impact of colonial modernity in the contemporary societies, or even in contemporary, particularly in contemporary scholars. So there's much that would be made about local authority power, for example, if they use Foucault as a model. But even when there's an opportunity to do so, we don't speak about the political hegemonies that continue to exist in our societies. So I think that, you know, both the works of these 3 individuals that I've chosen, Talal Asad, David Chidester, and Charles Long, never forget the construction of religion, you know, in the context of modernity, in context of colonialism. So scholars of postmodernism, or critical scholars, emphasize the theological roots of religious studies. They keep on emphasizing the fact that those people who are not critical enough, they are too theologically inclined, they become advocates of a particular political project, but they very rarely mention the fact that the world in which we live in has been actually been constructed, through notions of the modern state, through capitalism, and which was ushered in through modernity over the last 4 or 5 centuries or longer, like decolonial scholars say. So that's my second point, that I tried to emphasize this kind of distinction. I emphasize it. I think that when I'm reading the critical scholarship, I'm not saying that you can make a very sharp boundaries, but more or less, I think that when I'm looking at major critical scholars, I think that that is a divide, and I think that the scholars of postcolonial scholars have something distinctly interesting to offer for our next stage, for what we would call today a decolonial tradition. But I do differ with decolonial scholars who want to break away from the postcolonial as well. So I think that's perhaps a point that I'm trying to make, that there is something of value in decolonial scholarship as well. I think the third point that I want to emphasize in this paper is that after reviewing, I review each of the 3 scholars, and I distinguish between their contribution to a critical review of religion as a natural category, religion as a sort of a generalized category that can be used in the study of religion. It's not as if everybody believes in the same idea of a generalized category, but just the idea that you can speak about religion in the singular or the plural, and there's an assumption that the subject is the same. So what I'm arguing is that each of these scholars basically, points to a critique of that concept, particularly, as I said just now, that focusing on the colonial legacy and the colonial history. I start from the youngest of them, the most recent, David Chidester, youngest, but is also retired, Talal, Asad, and then also show how each of them make a contribution to the critique of religion, keeping in mind this kind of colonial legacy, colonial construction. At the same time, what I show is that each one of them point to the possibilities for religious studies. And so in that sense, I would like to claim that this is perhaps my main contribution that as I would like to make in this, that, the question that I raise is that how do you continue religious studies after critique? And I'm saying that you can do religious studies, one can do the study of religions after critique, as long as one remembers, the thesis of David Chidester, who says that, because religion has been invited and constructed in empire, that empire continues today. So, and I think that really means that you are studying religion in a kind of a post-empire or within the framework of the empire. And all of his work certainly points to the work of religion in the public life, the way in which religion has become a contestation of symbols. That's what David Chidester presents for us. I think his main contribution lies in that. I would like to support that and argue that that's something that one needs to distinguish between his critical engagement, the invention of religion, where he sort of undermines the study of religion, and then basically shows on another way that now that this religion has been invented for empire, what does it look like now? But I add to that, I sort of use Talal Asad to suggest that Talal Asad provides a way of thinking about, sort of what he calls religion as discourse, which I think in effect he's trying to show that there is this discourse that actually escapes modernity, escapes colonial modernity in some way. I think some of the students have pointed to these religious discourses, the pietistic discourses. I'm not in agreement with how they use what they have found, and I've written about it in the other paper that you've just mentioned of 2018. But I do think that this is something worthwhile to think of as something that David Chidester basically doesn't address or doesn't take into consideration. So I think that this, the space of, the space of religious discourse, as a discourse that resists or that avoids or that somehow, completely, completely ignores, the empire of religion of David Chidester should actually be taken into consideration. I don't necessarily think it means that you have to accept everything that goes on in that religious sphere, but I think that it is something that one should keep open for, and basically maybe a way, an arena for thinking about. And then I think that Charles Long, for example, I think in a kind of a reverse, because he's somebody who started with a critique of religion when it was very unfashionable to do so, but I mean, it's fascinating to see that he was doing that already in the 1960s. 67, 70s as such, when you don't hear about post-colonial scholarship, or at least there's this kind of critical scholarship. But Charles Long brings in the question of hermeneutics for me, I think, which is a different way of thinking about reading of religion, which somehow has been eclipsed, by Foucaultian studies after 1980s, when they began to make an impact in the study of religion. So I think Charles Long, what this hermeneutics gives us an opportunity to revisit how to study religion again in this kind of using kind of hermeneutical categories. I haven't elaborated on it, but this is where I think I would like to point to directions of how we can do that. So hermeneutical strategies, not necessarily only the ones that have been produced in modernity, or at least in the context of modern scholars, but also when one looks at pre-modern scholarships as well. So I think that in that sense, if I'd like to have Talal Asad and Charles Long talk to each other. If I wish they had, but I haven't seen any evidence, then I think that they basically speak to each other in such a way that the kind of resistance that Charles Long speaks about a kind of a discourse that Talal Asad says is possible, or at least is still evident in societies. So I hope I've given you some kind of idea about the paper. I maybe have left out too much of detail, but I'm hoping that there would be more in the discussion. We can explore some of the areas. I don't know if you allow me to go on to my next part, where I want to speak about my journey as such, or we could pick that up later. So I wanted to now do something that I have not done in the paper, but I thought that since when we had a discussion, you said you would like to see what I've been doing, so I gave some thought
yes,
about
that would be great. Please go ahead. Yes.
Okay. All right. So it's not a long story. One day, but I leave that to others to write about, or maybe if they have an opportunity, if they're interested in it. But what I would like to, in the context of this presentation, and also your introduction, perhaps I think it's useful, might be useful to speak about where I started and with the comparative study of religion. So I was introduced to comparative study of religion from an activist background in South Africa. I started at university, while I was doing studies in Islamic studies and Arabic as such. I was also involved with a religious activist group. And I then got a scholarship to study with Professor Ismail Farouqi, a Palestinian scholar who was based in the United States at the time. And Ismail Farouqi had set up a project that was rooted in a critical study of the social sciences. He had developed these ideas in the 1970s, actually from the 1950s onwards, but more particularly developed in the 1970s and 80s as a critique of the social sciences. So that critique of the social sciences was based on his reading of Islamic intellectual history. And he attracted students, and myself included, to sort of write a different, or to think about the social sciences and humanities using this Islamic intellectual history into account. He also was one of the, in fact, I've since written a paper on him. He wrote in 1964, very, very interesting, 2 essays actually on the study of religion, which I think is interesting, has not actually been recognized. sufficiently by people who now speak about the critical study of religion, because perhaps it might be sounding a little bit too much from an Islamic background. I mean, he was not doing that, but certainly he was an advocate for a sort of an Islamic intellectual history. During my PhD at, so that's my first background, just to give you some idea of that. But while I was doing my PhD, I was also, we had to do a number of courses, and that's when I was introduced to the study of religion. And I was quite convinced by the comparative study of religion. And in my PhD itself, I did not pursue or follow exactly what Ismail Faruqi was asking us to do. I was not I was not convinced by that project, because I was now attracted much more to the comparative study of religion. And from the comparative study of religion, which I accepted as a kind of some kind of a universal, that means a general experience of humankind, which was universal in my view at the time, and one could apply it to the study of Islam. And so therefore, from the time I finished my PhD, and then afterwards, I basically continued to apply or think about how to apply these categories, to the study of Islam, which I thought would, bring out aspects in the history of Islam, aspect in contemporary Islamic societies, which would actually bring out something that would be useful, not only for the academy, but I still maintain that it would be useful for Muslim societies and for South African societies in general. So I've been an active in terms of taking my work. I try to present it as much as possible, always to societies, to public level. In a way, I was not only speaking to the academy, but I was also speaking to context in the society. And that's how many of us were doing this kind of work in South Africa in the 1990s. But I want to emphasize that that for me, it was an application of, so during this time, for example, when you look at some of my work, you will see that I tried to use almost all kinds of terms like rituals or civil religion or ideology, all of these terms that I found useful. I just went ahead and applied them in Islamic context. But over the last maybe 10 years or so, perhaps a little bit longer, I began to appreciate or began to realize that there is some kind of a disjunction between what I was saying and what my interlocutors in Europe and America were actually talking about. I began to realize that there was some kind of we were not actually talking the same language. I sometimes felt that I was talking their language, but they were not talking my language. And I became more critically aware of this when I took one of the ideas that I had taken from the study of religion, which is this construction of the concept of religion. So it was this idea that religion is something that is constructed, that is not a natural category. As I mentioned in my paper, has been developing over the last couple of decades as such. And I specifically was inspired by the work of David Chidester and Talal Asad, who basically, as I said earlier, had sort of critically reviewed the construction of this word religion. So what I did with that is that I wanted to take this idea of the construction of religion, but actually apply it to Muslim intellectuals. So I started reading the work from the 19th century. I started reading work of Sayyid Ahmad Khan in India. Eventually, I realized that I was looking at Indian scholars and Egyptian scholars. That's my two areas that I work with. I don't read Urdu. I mean, I read Urdu as well, but it takes me a little bit longer. So I read sometimes in translation, but I can get along somewhat, much better, but not as well as my Arabic. But I started reading their work and basically at my first reading, it was obvious that they were thinking about religion, and they were using the word either madhab, in the Indian scholars, or deen in the Arab scholars, but they were making a distinction between deen and Islam, or madhab and Islam. And I saw them doing something very similar to what I was reading those scholars in Europe doing. That means European scholars who were beginning to think about religion as a sort of a generalized category. I found that to be similar with respect to the Muslim intellectuals as well. And I presented this book, and this is a book that was published in 2019, and I presented a few essays. And I actually presented this essay of mine in a volume of Scott Fitzgerald, who was also one of the leading scholars who was writing about this distinction. But when I read the reviews and I also read the other essays in this book, I realized that, everybody else was, deconstructing Western scholarship of the usage of religion, but I was using it to speak about Muslim intellectuals working with Islam. And so then I began to realize that this disjuncture between, sort of a review of how terms are used as intellectual categories, as analytical categories, but these analytical categories are part of a religious discourse. Whereas I think that the critical scholarship that I was reading, that I was inspired by, were actually focused, were not really interested in the Muslim intellectuals, were not really interested in the intellectual categories that were carried on within Muslim societies themselves, in this discourse of Islam. And so for me, that began a path of becoming much more aware. These conversations that I then set up between, intellectuals in the modern world, like Wittgenstein or Rumi and others, or William James and Rumi, for example, or William James and Ghazali, was to emphasize the fact that that this is where we need to begin to start. We need to think about Islamic discourse, or think about religious discourse in general. Obviously, I work with Islam because I know it better. That one needs to think about it not only as a kind of a religious discourse of devotion and blindness or loyalty, social cohesion, but also a critical element in the discourse as well. And that's what I found in Charles Taylor. So this is where I am sort of, in a way, become aware of the gaps between, the scholarship of religion, which still sort of remains outside, remains a sort of within the social sciences, within what one might call the critical scholarship, or at least whether it is humanities and the social sciences. And then at some level, I think, to think about, and as opposed to basically, I'm aware I benefit from that, but at the same time, I'm also opening up, or at least beginning to think about intellectual, debates, intellectual arguments, intellectuals of in discussions, for example, that are taking place within religious communities. So since the last time I heard Professor Banerjee Prathama at the Southern Theory lecture at Berlin, she spoke, I was quite fascinated by her reading of Mahabharata. And so I was actually inspired to start reading a translation of it for the last couple of weeks. Every morning I read a section. I don't know if this is the right way to do so, but anyway, I'm just deciding to read it myself. And first of all, I'm sort of fascinated by the text. I mean, it sort of confirms what you had spoken about in December. But one of the terms that I keep on coming across is the term dharma. Now, I've heard before the meaning of dharma and such, but as I've been reading this, this conflict between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, I hope I've got the names correctly, the two families, every now and then this concept of the idea of dharma keeps on coming up. I don't know, I don't want to say this is religion, although I have heard people translating it as a religion, but it certainly seems like a kind of a very interesting intellectual, or a kind of a concept that is used in the Mahabharata, and perhaps, and then further used within the discourse in India, for example, to speak about, to speak critically about the self and society and others. And I think this is one direction in which I want to sort of follow up on this paper that I've been doing, and I hope that we can do this, in sort of in a conversation, certainly with others who, steeped in this tradition. Maybe I'll have one last comment, maybe as a sort of a statement. I think, the study of religion has always been rooted in the idea that he who knows one knows none. This is a maxim that was pronounced, I think, by Max Muller in the 19th century, who says that you have to know lots of religions in order to speak about religion in general. And I think this is rooted in the idea that if you study many different religions, then you can sort of somehow come to a concept of religion in a sort of universal, generalized sense. Now, this critical scholarship has actually shown the problem of this idea. But nevertheless, I think where my work has actually come from, for better or for worse, is actually to start from the singular tradition. And I'm not saying that the general or other religious traditions are not useful or not valuable, but I am, in my own scholarship, I've actually been aware of the difficulty of this term. So on the one hand, one thinks about the scholarship that has worked on this generalized understanding, and as opposed to those people who work only on, at least who work on singular tradition, I don't think there has been a sufficient kind of conversation between the two, because the people who work, say for example, on texts in China or texts in India or in Islam, for example, don't see that the scholars of religion are actually too generalized. They don't know the complexity of their religious traditions. And I think that you need to basically need this kind of both kind of traditions. On the one hand, you need those steeped within a particular area or a particular set of texts or discourse, I like to call it, from Talal Asad. And on the other hand, one also have this conversation across across the board as well. So thank you very much for this opportunity again, and I will pause there for a moment.
Thank you very much, Professor Tayob. I'm sure a kind of physical applause is a rare thing in today's world. So, and thank you also for sharing your intellectual autobiography. That was also very useful for us to make sense of the paper and your other work as well. So your paper was called Religion After Critique. And it's a very, very, what should I say, very, very precise way of zeroing in on our condition of being in today's world, where we are indeed steeped in religion and varieties of religiosities, but we are all, in a sense, after critique. And so it is a condition of life, as well as, in a sense, a kind of epistemological location in which we find ourselves. Before I open the floor to questions and comments from my colleagues, just to tell those who are on Zoom that please feel free to write in your questions in the Q&A window of Zoom. And I want to quickly, Professor Tayob, ask you one or two opening kind of questions or queries. You are one of those where we are, I mean, that is, I am speaking from a location, India, where there is no institutional site for religious studies. In other words, our universities and academics do not have religion as a discipline, a modern discipline. And there is a history to that, and why, I mean, we can go into that later, why of course, in the West, one knows why, but why in a context such as South Africa, there would be departments of religious studies and not in a place like India. It's an interesting comparative thing to do. So for us, the study of religion is primarily dispersed across the mainstream social sciences. So some historians work on religion, some anthropologists work on religion, political scientists work on secularism and religion, and so on and so forth. Which is why religion as an object of study is in some senses not quite established. What is primarily studied is the question of religious identity and/or the question of religious ideology. In other words, politics around religion is studied, but other aspects of religion, except some anthropological work, are really not taken on board. So in that context, I wanted to know your thoughts on how does one bring together a study of longer traditions of religious thought, which may equally be traditions of philosophical thought and traditions of theological thought, or even legal thought or jurisprudential thought. So that longer tradition of what we today subsume under the umbrella of religion, and what we do as ethnographers on the ground. In other words, what we study as religious practices of the contemporary. So if one imagines, let us say, a discipline of religious studies after critique, how does one bring longer philosophies and contemporary practices methodologically together? That's something that all of us struggle with, not just with respect to religion, but with respect to the general project of what we call decolonization of thought. Right. So I wanted to know your thought on this a little bit. And I wanted to also, you're one of those scholars who do not look at the Western tradition, so-called, as a homogeneous block, because you are very clear that there is an Enlightenment tradition and then there is an anti-Enlightenment tradition within the Western philosophical tradition. And you distinguish between philosophers within the Western philosophical tradition with whom you want to set up a dialogue or set your own interlocutors on a dialogue. In that context, would you say that despite a lot of heterogeneity within Enlightenment history, let's say, is critique and what you in another place call the hermeneutics of suspicion, which I think is a very apt term to, again, characterize our epistemological orientation, would you say that across all diversities of Enlightenment thought with which you are engaging from your location within Islamic intellectual tradition, is hermeneutics of suspicion a widely shared, and what will be your, I mean, how do you distinguish critique and hermeneutics of suspicion, and what is your take on the latter? So that's the kind of set of thoughts that I had as I read your paper and your other work. So if you would like to respond to this, and then we'll open the floor to questions and other comments. You're muted, Professor Tayob.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I did that because I didn't want you to hear my clicks on my phone and my computer. So in South Africa, we have departments of religious studies, but there has been a struggle between departments of religious studies and theological departments, because of the Christian background of South Africa. We've had faculties of theology or departments of theology now established as part of the universities. As you know, this is a feature of what has happened in Western countries as well. And University of Cape Town has been one of the first to establish a study of religion, because it sees itself as a secular university as such. I don't want to go in a long history. But my experience of a really good center was actually in India. Twice I came to Jamia Millia. I was frantically looking for my friend and colleague whose name I have forgotten. I apologize for that right now, but I will relate it to my gray hairs. I've been in touch with her, and she's and she organized a conference of law. They organized a conference on law and religion, but this is recently. And from that meeting, at that meeting, there were some wonderful papers presented on law and religion. None of the people who presented papers were actually from religious studies, but I was fascinated, and I presented a paper on South Africa, only one on South Africa. But I was fascinated with that discussion because I think scholars of India could not actually ignore the study of religion. But I really felt that the strength came from with them came from the fact that they were drawing from, whether they were political scientists, sociologists, legal scholars, media people as such. I really find that was probably one of my best conferences that I've attended, period. Before that, I was invited to Jamia Millia. They used to have, unfortunately, they closed it down. Unfortunately, I can't remember this colleague's name, friend's name. She's moved to the south now. Anyway, I won't try to remember it because But she organized, it was a center for religions, I think, at the Jamia Millia as well. Religions and worldviews or something like that. It was not a department, it was a center. And they had a very interesting setup there. In fact, they had people from different, a lot of them studying Hindu texts, others studying Islam, others Christianity. And I was invited to present a paper there. This was the first time I visited India. This was in 2010. And in that paper, I found that discussions with students had a lot of interesting discussions. I felt that, that is a kind of institute that perhaps one can that I would sort of think about as a good way of actually building in. You have people who are based there, but also who can use the opportunity then to draw on the strength of the other disciplines. So I suppose that links up with what you asked the second. So yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that's sort of getting to the heart of something that I have been thinking about. So sometimes in my mode, I just simply say, I don't want to have anything, I don't want to learn anything from Western scholars. But then sometimes when I think back about it, I said, you know what, I've learned a lot from people, whether it is Immanuel Kant or whether it is Immanuel Nietzsche. I know they're all contradictory, but somehow I think this is what I am, and I think certainly in a certain sense, this is what we are. But perhaps this is where we need to bring in a hermeneutic suspicion to their work as well. And I don't think we can do any worse than to actually use the reflections that we get in a longer history. So this is where I think that that kind of hermeneutical approach or hermeneutic of suspicion would take us a little bit away from just a deconstruction by beginning to raise questions. And this is why in my recent development of the work, actually, I'm looking at questions of ethics and morality. I thought this was a kind of I know that it is a particularly difficult stage now, but when I initially started this project, I was thinking about this because this is a concern that I saw within South Africa, trying to introduce the study of religion. So I thought that this was a better way to do that, to think about ethics and morality, because I thought that this is an area that has been ignored in the study of religion, and perhaps one can introduce those ideas at least from the scholarship. So I also bring people sort of the ethical projects. This is the latest paper that you cited earlier, together with contemporary scholars.
All right, thank you very much, Tayob. Ask some of my colleagues would have comments. So we will. There are some questions on the chat box, but we'll come to those in a moment. If there is a question from the floor here. So maybe we can start. All right. My colleague Hilal Ahmed has a comment for you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Tayob, for a fascinating paper. I haven't read it, so whatsoever you said, I just follow that and follow rather carefully. And I find it fascinating for a number of reasons. But when you link it to your intellectual autobiography, that raises a few more interesting questions, which link to your object of study, because you made a few very interesting comments and statement in your presentation. One is that you study a singular tradition. That I find quite fascinating. And your idea on hermeneutics of suspicion is something also raise another set of questions. So the question which is coming from, if I link these two comments, as I said that I am not fully aware of your work, so this is something from outside. The question then would become, how would you, and again, let me also link it to the statement which you made, the distinction between theological study of religion and religion, the critical social scientific study of religion. If that is the case, then your location raises a few important questions. Like, first of all, the idea of faith, which is very critical. So how should we think of critical faith in an act where the identity which is given to you, the identity of a Muslim, as well as your object of analysis, that is also Islam. So the question of faith is important in this case, first. Sorry. Secondly, the second point is about the singular tradition. Does the study of this singular tradition helps you, or that create more hurdles for you? It reminds me of Abdullah Hamoudi's work on Hajj, where he makes a very fascinating argument that I was trying to encounter the tradition which I believe I know, but when I, as a researcher, went there, I realized that I don't know, and there were several issues which were new to me, despite the fact I call it my own tradition. And by the way, like you, he is also engaging with Talal Asad. So these are the two things which I would like you to respond. Thank you.
Professor Tayob, is it okay if we take a few questions at one go and then come back to you? Is that all right with you?
If you don't mind, I prefer just to try to answer briefly. I mean, I recognize the value of these questions, so
go ahead.
I'll try to keep brief, but it will just, I think, give me a good sense of, yeah. So, yeah, I think that's getting to the heart of the matter, as it were. So, yeah, it's a singular tradition, but it's also very difficult to think about Islam as a singular tradition because of its complexity geographically, historically. So in a way, in fact, you're really not a singular tradition. So that's the first thing I would like to say. I'm aware of that complexity of that. Just they mentioned Hamoudi's, the book on Hajj and his other work as such. I'm not necessarily running away from the question, but I think it helps you to think about complexity in a slightly different way rather than saying, this is Christianity, this is Islam, this is Hinduism, this is, Buddhism as such. So I think this is the advantage that you get from those people who start working from comparative religions. This is what I was saying earlier. They often simplify. And so therefore they have a certain advantage, but they also have there's a kind of a disadvantage of working from that. So because you're forced to work with complexity, then you will say, or at least to work with multiple religions. So you will say, okay, I will work with Islam and Hinduism in India. But then you have to say, okay, I'm going to step away from China or from somewhere else. So I think there are several advantages and disadvantages that come from that. I mean, the other question is about your own position. I think that can also be an advantage of working that. So as far as the theological, because I grew up, or at least I was schooled in the comparative study of religion, and when I decided that I'm going to distance myself from my teacher, Ismail Faruqi, or at least his ideas, I decided to take on, kind of an observer position in South Africa. And yet I was still studying Islam, and yet I was still, offering whatever I was doing as a kind of a mirror to Muslims when I finished my work, or at least those people who were interested. That's what I was sort of doing. At the same time, I was presenting it to scholars of religion who would be interested in that work. So I basically straddled that kind of position. So I think that as far as the question of faith was concerned, I use the study of religion in order to step aside from it, but it's not a question that one could actually get away with. So over the years, I've been as I've been revisiting that position, so I've become aware, for example, that the debate that we used to have, there used to be in South Africa, a massive debate between, the theologians and the scholars of religion. And for myself, I often used to see myself, I don't know whether others saw myself, but I saw myself as a scholar of religion, not as a theologian. And other colleagues, basically, who were much more, sort of very committed to their tradition, but in a critical way. They didn't agree with, many of them were liberation theologians, for example, both in Islam and Christianity, Hinduism and Judaism, for example. And I'm now beginning to think that that there was a lot of value in what they were doing and what they had to say, which those of us who, working from the study of religion, basically were not really interested in talking at that time. And I'm realizing that this is where we need to basically, not actually break the boundaries of this work as such. So, and I think this idea that, because of your faith, you would actually be prevented from, doing a proper study, I don't actually support that. I do think that, it can come in the way, just like your commitment to your blind commitment to any ideology or view can actually prevent you from doing this as well. Let me, stop there and so that we can keep the conversation going. But thank you very much for that.
Ravi Sundaram.
Thank you, Professor, for your very stimulating talk. I wanted to ask you to expand more on the political currency of this term you use, decolonial. I already see elements in your presentation which I can connect with. For example, when you frame your intervention, you are doing it in terms of other scholars on Islam, Muslim scholars in the non-Western world, by and large. So in the sense, your genealogy of intervention is not within the classic decolonial strategy of referring to Mignolo or Quijano or in the other tradition. So I want you to expand a bit on this, because I understood completely your references to Talal Asad and that debate. How would you open up this question within a distinctive addition to the larger post-colonial debate within the framework of comparative religion? Thank you.
So I do read Grossvogel. In fact, in this paper, in the full paper, I have used Grossvogel as actually a framework for studying the Muslim archive, if I may call it that. So I'm using the decolonial scholar of particularly Grossvogel. When I was reading Mignolo, Grossvogel, and others, I do disagree with them in the sense that. So first of all, let me say where I agree with them. So I think I like Grossvogel's idea of opening up the space, actually thinking about the Southern theorists. So this is where I'm actually saying that if one thinks about taking recognition of Southern theorists, I'm suggesting that in the study of religion, the scholars of Islam, for example, have to be recognized, or maybe we can look more critically at their work. Obviously, both recognizing what is useful and what is not. So I think that I'm using Grossvogel's broad framework to do so. But I would like to perhaps mention, maybe just as part of the conversation, maybe what, reading their work, I do think that I don't necessarily, see yet an evidence among people who are working in the study of religion, who are looking at these, particularly, I've just completed another paper, starting from Edward Said. I'm thinking about the exiled scholars, the scholars from, from the so-called developing world, third world, whatever we might call it as such, who are often located within academy, but who have basically addressed questions in, very different kinds of questions, different kind of work as such. So I'm suggesting that maybe there is something of value to them as well, and that's what I'm doing in this paper. Because some people might say, that Chidester and Talal Asad and Charles Long, for example, they were very much part of the academy, part of the Western academy. Why are you separating that? I'm saying that in this paper, I'm trying to suggest that they are addressing things in a very different way. And so that's why I am, that's part of what I'm trying to do in my paper.
Rakesh Pan.
Thank you very much, Professor Tayob. And this has been one of the, I would say, central concerns in CSDS for long, but mostly by way of looking into the question of modernity, modernization, and other ways. And I think here you have opened up the question of religion. I just wanted to would like to have your response on what you mentioned somewhere while talking about your autobiographical details, is that there was a moment when you started with the critique of social science itself. And I was trying to think that there was a moment, and there was I would say, rather long period coming from the nationalist and nationalist critique of modern knowledge in India itself, to think about social sciences itself. And what I want to raise here is something very important, to think about religion, the modern study of religion in relation to social sciences. Because what I find, and the very interesting question actually relates to. It's also my puzzle about Talal Asad, whom I have tried to read very carefully. And the way Talal Asad has evolved, now I see that you feel as if Talal Asad, as a post-colonial critic of religion, one can actually agree with that. But then there is another part of Talal Asad where religion actually becomes some kind of self-enclosed realm, or there is no hermeneutic approach possible to religion. And the example, which is important because you distinguished between the post-colonial and the post-modern slash deconstructionist approaches to religion. But interestingly, that is where Talal Asad, when he engages on the question of religion with post-structuralists like Derrida, and he increasingly actually claims that the domain of religion actually is a kind of self-enclosed domain. And I'm using this term self-enclosed as my reading, but that is how Talal Asad does when he talks about ritual and language becoming the sites which is not available to anyone. It's only available to people who have access to those domains of religion and language. Only then the question of religion can be opened up. So one part is the critique of religion, the very idea of religion, and to actually smash the distinction between the religion and the world. While at the same time, there is an attempt to claim the distinctiveness of religion as a world itself. So I'm rather putting my queries before you, because you have done a long-term study of this. How would you respond about this puzzle? Am I right? I think.
Well, I couldn't have put it in a better way. I think this is exactly my thought about Talal Asad as well, and what I've tried to articulate in the paper. So Talal Asad has got this two, bifurcated positions. And I have been struggling and arguing against him on the second part. His understanding of the discourse of Islam actually turns to a, particularly McIntyre, and in a recent paper, he turned particularly to a particular understanding of Wittgenstein, which gives him this a kind of, what you say, the kind of, a self-enclosed space as such. But my understanding of religious discourse, when one reads it in a much, and I've just been reading, philosophical investigations of Wittgenstein, recently I've been, normally, at least myself, I've been reading different essays. So recently I started reading it from the beginning. And I actually realized that Wittgenstein has got a much more, because he's working on this idea of everyday language, he's got a much more complex understanding of what is a discourse, religious discourse. So I don't know whether I want to, declare myself to be a Wittgensteinian, but at least I think that his understanding of discourse is actually much more complex than what Talal Asad makes it out to be. So Talal Asad excludes, and his students, for example, exclude any kind of critical reflection, critical debate taking place, different positions, especially within, say, whether it is in Islamic theology or tradition as such. And this is where I disagree with Talal Asad in that way. I think I don't know why that is so. I think it's a way of speaking about groups of people who resist, kind of Western imperialism. But at the same time, what it does is that from this representation of Islamic discourse as self-enclosed, as sort of coherent, doesn't allow for the critical voices to come in, and for this kind of debate that ensues, that you do find within societies as such. So I think this is, what you've said is perfectly my understanding of Talal Asad, and I think that I see it as a particular way of thinking about discourse, and therefore I think it is also a problem of how, maybe Dean in this case, or Dharma as such, we have a tendency, I think it's a problem of trying to, problem of translation, right? It's a problem of using discourse as a way to say, well, this is what a religion is, or this is what Deen is, or Islam is. The same way that people used to think about, terms like civilization, culture, all of these terms are obviously translations and generalized terms. So I think we need to be very cautious about that.
So may I read out a couple of questions from the chat box, which is from the general audience?
Yes,
So there is a question from Soumitra Roy from Bengal, who asks the relationship between the race question and the religion question in the post-colonial national life of South Africa. There is a second question connecting to Talal Asad's work, which asks, what is your thoughts on the criticism of Talal Asad that has been offered by scholars like Samuli Shilke? There's a third question, if you want to go there, wants to know more of your thoughts on the comparative method. Again, another, many questions are going around the issue of the relationship between sociology, ethnography, anthropology, practices, and the question of, and the relationship with the question of philosophy in religious traditions. I think that seems to be an abiding concern in many people's mind. Professor Mohinder Singh from Jawaharlal Nehru University asks, he believes that the translation of terms like dharma, deen, mazhab as religion is problematic because of the inadequacies of such translations. And on the other hand, the use of the term religion as a universal translational equivalent is by now more or less accepted, and you too seem to be accepting it. He wants you to actually, because you are also a scholar of language, and that is how you have also trained yourself, he actually wants you to reflect more on the question of translation as part of the study of religion. I think if you could respond to these, and then we have another set in the chat box, which I'll read out.
Thank you very much for these as well. Yeah, on the question of race, I think that I should have the most to say being in South Africa, but unfortunately, I have the least to say about this. So, maybe this is a blind spot in my work. I do think that it plays a very, very important role in specifically in Islamic history, in Islamic culture. But I haven't, and there have been some studies that argue that there's some interesting studies that argue that I think it's by VL, who's basically saying that the whole question of development of the question of religion was actually a question of race. So it was a kind of another term used for racialization. So all the different categories that were developed, in the study of religion were actually racial categories. And I do think a little bit about this in terms of, whenever I'm working in South Africa, and when you work specifically with African religions as such, because the work categories that I'm thinking about, or at least the work that I'm thinking about in Islam works with text, for example, and so therefore what you do with oral text, for example, what do you do with, and how do you basically overcome that divide as such? So I will plead my ignorance about this and just pause there rather than trying to come up with a sort of an answer or at least some kind of intelligent discussion, but maybe just declare my sort of being a little bit stumped with that. The question of Shilka is much easier because anyway, this is back to our discussion of Talal Asad. I think basically Shilka is someone who was known to me. I know him personally, but I also know his work intimately because this has been the debate going on between Talal Asad and Silka and Talal Asad and the different schools in anthropology. What I see the work that Shilka points out to is actually he doesn't address the question of the discourse of Islam. All he says is that he tells the Talal Asad and particularly some of his students like Sabah Mahmoud and others that they have misrepresented Islamic, they have misrepresented Muslim societies. That the pietistic group are not actually that influential, or they're not as overwhelming. And I think he's doing that generally. And somebody, I hope if you are here, or that you might hear me, you will forgive me for my generalization. But it's precisely to tell the Western world that Muslims are not that pious, and they're not necessarily that devoted to religion. They are also like ordinary people. They're also like other Westerners. Sometimes they pray and sometimes they don't pray. But my question is, that doesn't necessarily address the question of what is a discourse. Is it only about piety, like we just discussed, or is it something else? So I think that the students, at least Shami Shulka, misses the point as far as I'm concerned. Because they want to sort of represent still the Muslim society, they are saying that Sabah Mahmood and others are not representing the society, where Sabah Mahmood may say, I'm just talking about this pietistic group. Where I'm coming in my work is I'm actually saying, I want you to talk to the pietistic group and actually include in it the critical voices that they are hearing in Egypt, and that they are refusing to listen to, because that is what I understand Egyptian society to be like. That when I did some interviews with people in my studies, for example, I see people who are crossing these kind of tendencies or groups as such. So it's not somebody who just decides to devote themselves. They are very much aware of the complexity of the voices that they're hearing in their societies, and then they decide whether they want to become one group or the other. So in a way, I think Shami Shulka, he's got a point, but I think he's not addressing the issue of the discourse itself. I think on the question of the disciplines and the comparative method, I actually think that, for me, I'm increasingly beginning to see that philosophy probably is the more dominant discipline, and that other disciplines somehow translate it into their own perspectives. I might be wrong about this, but this is just a general observation that I see. So so philosophy still seems to be, if I look at trends in sociology or trends in the study of religion, you sort of, at least in the way that it is developed in modern academy, Western academy, but in South Africa as well. So you have, dominant, deconstruction or dominant modernism, for example, or more specifically also trends within those. Maybe, you suddenly will hear something about, aesthetics, for example. But these will sometimes, when I trace them back, I actually realize that they started with some kind of philosophical traditions, philosophical reflections, and then they are translated into the disciplines. And then sometimes I feel like a little bit of a fool, because I realize that I'm just picking up the breadcrumbs, right? So then I go back and actually say, okay, well, this is a reading of Wittgenstein, or this is a reading of, Charles Taylor, or maybe this is a reading of this, and then we sort of translate it for the study. And I'm actually beginning to think, no, I'm not interested only in just following the trend. I will basically try to see what is, this is why I rely on reading Southern scholars or reading scholars in the past, for example, to get some different ideas. I'm not necessarily saying they're not useful, but I sort of think that these are trends that I'm beginning much more now to question whether they are actually really useful. So that's the point I want to make about discipline. Much more can be said, but let me pause with that. I think the question on the translation of Deen Dharma into religion as universal and accepted, yes, I think that's useful. And you added the question about how does one think about this as a language. This is what I find it useful. So yes, in a way, I think that this is what the scholarship on the study of religion, particularly I'm emphasizing with the postcolonial scholars, tell us something about the condition of our society. And actually, this is something that we can benefit from, that we can take into consideration when we study, Islam or Hinduism or Christianity now, for example. But on the other hand, I think when one thinks about concepts, then these other concepts, whether it's Dharma or Deen. So for example, because of my familiarity with Deen or questions, I'm always looking at what Deen, not only in a sort of originally meant or what it meant in the past or in dictionaries as such, but also be very carefully attentive to what it means in different times and in different contexts as such. So I'm not only on the one hand, I think when we can sit together in this great institute that I suggested we should get, revive in Jamia Millia. But if we can have this conversation, and perhaps this is a good way to think about it, to bring in this, for example, from my side, or at least for other people who know better Arabic than me, but I have seen enough sufficient complexity in the way deen has been used in the intellectual history of Islam. It is also very complex in the way it is used in the Quran. It is, Sufis used it in a very different way, So it's actually, I think that those are the kinds of, once you make the comparison, then you should not stop at that comparison, but continue to dig into the traditions and obviously dig into the experiences also, historical experiences, for those people who are in the tradition of sociological or anthropological for that matter as well, in order to be able to see that. So I think the opportunity is not necessarily to have, like we had a positing of a sort of a natural category, and then use it across the board, in a sort of an uncomplicated
way. With your permission, Professor Tayob, there's a set of questions that ask about the ordinary everyday experience of being a Muslim. Experience of the self and not an ethnographer's study of Muslim lives, and ambiguity and other difficulties of everyday Muslimness, and the question of what is an Islamic tradition. What would you say is, what would your response be to the question of Muslim everyday lives as embodied and as experienced selves? So that's one question that's one kind of questions that has come up quite a bit. I'm just putting together a number of questions just to keep this short. There is a question by our colleague Shell Mayram, who of course asks if there is any way to define a universal category called religion in terms of the human condition or existential condition of death, morbidity, immortality. Is there a kind of minimalist definition of religion that we can work with at all? And if that can be brought into play as an academic concept, is the kind of question that she has. She also has an additional question on the notion of archive/library that you started with, and wants to ask how far the debate on archive and library have moved forward from the earlier post-colonial moment of subaltern studies and such like, which was a question of representation. Is everybody's voice available in the archive? Can the subalterns speak? Kind of a question. But what is the decolonial question regarding archives and libraries? Is that question, in what ways is that question different from the earlier question of the 1990s, coming from South, such as the Subaltern Studies Collective and such like? I think that's more or less the kind of questions that have come up. So if you would like to, I just had an additional question to do with the race thing that you somehow said, but because when studies the history of heterogeneous Christianities across the world, from various Black evangelical movements in the US to in the southern part of our own country, ex-untouchable Christian churches and mobilizations. It does strike me that the fact that you locate yourself in some senses within a longer tradition of Islamic studies, and there, even though it may be located in Africa, in South Africa, is there something in the Islamic tradition, which is of course multi-geographical tradition, no doubt, where the race question has not historically emerged in the way that the race question has emerged from within Christianity because of Christianity's imbrication with the with the larger colonial, slave colonial and later colonial formations. So it might not just be an accidental blind spot in your oeuvre, but is it something that is contingent upon the different histories of Christianity and Islam? I mean, when one talks about, when one reads Islamic scholars from within India, some of which I have for other reasons, there is and this is, they're writing in the 20th century, there's a constant harping on the fact that race is one thing that is not thinkable from within Islam, such that, you know, there are other forms of social inequalities, but racial inequality is not one. So could it be two different histories which come to the race question from two different angles, perhaps? Now, I'm just thinking aloud with your response to that question. So if you could go ahead and respond.
Thank you very much for bringing the race question back in. So I'll come back to that. Thank you very much for adding that on. So about the question on ordinary experiences, I can comment on what has been happening at the moment very briefly, and again, you know, in a sort of a generalized way. I think that the work, a lot of the works, especially in the study of Islam, and basically based on my close reading of this work, I have been arguing with them that arguing with the scholarship to say that they're ignoring the discourse of Islam. They're ignoring the discourse of Islam that is actually present in, present in Muslim societies. And I think some of the work has actually been inspired by Samuel Schilke and others who argue against Asad. So they're going on the other extreme of not recognizing what is happening, on a very ordinary basis, on an ordinary experiential basis as such. So I'm saying that what I would like to add to this particular, and some of my students who have done some work on this, is actually to say, when you look at the ordinary experience of religion, the embodied experience of religion, it's not necessarily cut off from this discourse. It's very much part of that discourse. Now, I don't necessarily mean to say that there is no doubts, and there's no backtracking. In fact, a few years ago, I started a project on biographies, precisely in order to capture this. Life trajectories, biographical trajectories. And the purpose of that was not to use it as a way to say, like I said earlier in my response on Schilke's work, is not to actually show that the discourse is actually, these experiences no longer form part of Islam or no longer part of the discourse of Islam, but actually to revisit what is the meaning of the discourse itself. As you can see, my answer to what is Islamic tradition, it's very difficult. I'm not so sure whether tradition, when I think about tradition, I think about McIntyre in a very, organized way, or discourse Wittgenstein. So I'm not so sure whether I've yet come up with a useful term that I would like to hang, to mask my colors on the wall with as a way. I think these are useful terms. They can work to a certain extent, but then afterwards they don't work, and then we have to look for something else. So at the moment, I'm trying to, I think I find myself more, finding, both the useful as the not too useful categories. I sort of somehow think that maybe these are not useful terms at all, and we should find another way of talking about them. I'm talking about tradition. I think the next question on whether there are some existential questions, I think that's I think quite interesting, and I think this is what we should put forward as a kind of a project. When I was reading, some scholars were, because of my interest in Wittgenstein, I was always interested in what people made of Wittgenstein. Interestingly, Wittgenstein, has not really been as popular among lots of people use discourse, but Foucault obviously has overshadowed, because of his approach to discourse, and his discourse of power has overshadowed, the kind of work that has been done directly within Wittgensteinian studies as such. But there are some scholars who basically suggested that at the end of the day, when one looks at a religious tradition, you can actually speak about, at the end of the day, life, death, as fundamental questions. I think that's a very attractive way of doing that, but I think one needs to subject you know, I don't know whether, you know, whether this would be a useful way of doing this, but I think it's useful to put that as a question, not necessarily to say, okay, you know, Islam is all about, you know, death, or it's all about life, for example, or all traditions are about life, or religions are about life, and then we can maybe compare. I think we need to use the hermeneutics in order to think about fundamental questions. I mean, obviously in conversation with each other, and then maybe go back and you know, from different disciplinary backgrounds, one could, for example, you know, sort of pick up some of those questions. I think it's a very useful question. The question on archive, are these the same questions? Yes, I think that they are the same questions as Spivak's question, can a subaltern speak? And I think that what I'm addressing here is, I'm aware that I mean, that question has been, especially with, for example, the recent movements of, you know, Black Lives Matter, or at least within South Africa, you know, questions that have been raised specifically among LGBTQ+, for example. These are still questions that are raised, that are offered in so many different sites as such. But I was addressing myself specifically, you know, within the study of religion, that still we are finding the colonial library is actually very dominant as such. So I think with this paper, what I'm trying to do is basically trying to set up, you know, and I'm doing it partly as a teacher, because I'm trying to tell my students to say, you know what, this is where you start with. So I'm as part of our research project, you know, I'm not necessarily saying you don't read anybody else, but I think this is where you would start from. This is the basis on which you would build. I am thinking that this is something that still needs a lot of work, not only one paper, and maybe many of us coming together to write this, to build this archive, and then to actually set up projects, you know, based on these or perhaps others. I'm not necessarily, you know, saying that these are the only ones that are useful, but as a way to really build up a sort of an intellectual tradition. So I think that there has been a lot of awareness, you know, of the silences of people as such, that people are made silent in the broader intellectual discourse. That's why I started with the work of Mudimbe, and I'm sort of addressing that question directly, because I don't see it. So as far as the question of race, I don't agree with at all that this question of race is not present in Islam, or for them, but in South Africa. It's actually a very important question. I have a PhD student at the moment who is looking at African, particularly Black African Muslims, and their representation of traditions, or their representation of tradition in a radically different way. And there's a huge amount of criticism against what are called South Asian Muslims in South Africa, or Muslims of Southeast Asian origins, Indonesia and Malaysia, and the kind of traditions that they have established. I think one can speak broadly about, you know, the problem of race. It has not been sufficiently raised within Islamic studies, or in what I would call the intellectual discourse of Islam, except in the modern period, as a kind of a defense that actually this is a problem that we don't have, or this is a problem that does not exist. But I don't think it does not exist. I think it does exist. Where I didn't want to make a comment was, I'm not so sure how I want to, you know, I didn't have any comment to think about the relationship between race and religion. That's why I sort of stayed away from it. But as a problem within Muslim society, particularly contemporary Muslim society, or through the experience of race, for example, or the history of slavery in Africa, or what is often called Arab slavery or Islamic slavery, I think that is certainly had very strong understanding of preconditions about what Black people are. And I think that's something that's very much a critical issue that one cannot ignore within the study of Islam, or the study of within Muslim discourse as such. But when I engage with scholars in West Africa, particularly, or with scholarship in West Africa, I mean contemporary scholars I'm talking about, or when you look at the scholars of, you know, of the jihad movements in the 18th century or the 17th and 18th century, that's when you don't, the issues that they are raising as such, they don't raise the kind of issue that you see in African Christianity, for example, with modern Christianity, and as Christianity spread into South Africa, for example, or in other parts of Africa, or like we know in America, for example, even though there were these, very clear, this enslavement of Black people, for example, and the kind of assumptions that are made of Black people is in the discourse, one doesn't see that reflected in the Muslim discourse and the Muslim discussions about slavery or about Black people as such. I'm not aware of that. That's why I was sort of hesitant to sort of get into that. But I think that it's a very important issue, I think, in the experience of modern Islam, and certainly within South Africa as well.
Close it here. And once again, we are very, very grateful for your presence. And thank you very much. And hopefully this is the beginning of a much longer conversation, both individually with you, but also institutionally, sooner than later. Thank you for coming to us.
It's a privilege for me to be here with you.